Welcome to Facts as we continue to finalize this one chapter that we've been dealing with for quite some time now. We're finishing up the last elements when we touch the subject of the Synoptic Gospels. We've spent 2 weeks covering the origin of the Gospels from Papias' eye testimony starting first, how that translated into his perspective of the Gospel of Mark, being Peter, the main guy behind it, Mark as interpreter, chase that down from the other church fathers and how they were consistent in their witness of that. And then we moved ourselves over to Matthew's gospel, starting with Papias once again, along with the others. And then we finished up the last 2 weeks with Luke's gospel. Today's a little bit different of an episode than our weekly episodes. We're going to be bringing in a guest and a friend of mine, and also one of our apologists, a part of Explain International, who debates this topic probably more often than anyone. He has debated Bart Ehrman, Richard Carrier, Robert Price, and we'll be doing another debate coming up soon on this subject, which we will discuss at the very end. But we're going to bring him in. We're going to carry in this discussion, and we're going to bring in the evidence, but also have some pushback, because what you'll find out is that not everybody agrees on this subject. I, for one, have a different of an opinion than some that I do ministry with, and some that sit down and look at the same documentation that I look at. Though minute in nature, it is good to have people on your team that do not agree with everything you say and everything that you do. So today, I'd like to bring in my friend Jonathan Sheffield, the one and only Anglican, who is on the apologetics team right now. Go ahead and say hello to everybody. Jonathan, tell everybody a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into some of the content that we have been discussing.
Okay, well, thank you, Stephen, once again, for partnering up with me. It's been a great journey so far. Love all the work that we're doing with Explain International. But as myself, Jonathan Sheffield, born and raised in the Anglican Communion. And over the last, 4 or 5 years, really put a lot of study into defending the reliability of the New Testament, inerrancy, and sitting down with a number of people in the academy to really challenge them on some of the views. But that's so much for myself.
Yes, the Anglican part is known. Anybody that knows you for at least 0.2 seconds at least knows that one thing about you. And we're both Italian. So, I mean, this is an Italian show tonight. We should have whipped out some pasta or made some Alfredo or something like that and made our viewers a little bit happier. But we will talk about Italy a little bit, at least as the realm of the Gospel of Mark goes, because seems to have some influence in the Italian area there pretty early on in church history. So, Jonathan, let's go ahead and jump into the discussion that Papias made at the end of the first century into the second century about the Gospel of Mark particular. And he had made comment that he had learned things from John the Elder and Aristion, and perhaps, and you and I have slightly different opinion about this as well. I believe you hold that John the Elder and John the Apostle was being utilized as the same guy, whereas I would actually say they're not the same guy. They're probably two different guys, but I'm also not willing to die over it. But it seems to be that regardless of one's position on John the Elder, that he had original eyewitnesses of Jesus who were discussing content with him about the origin of how things came to be in written text tradition. And he started with Mark as being Peter's interpreter, which became a consistent phrase by Jerome, Eusebius, Irenaeus. They were using the same terminology when it came to him, but he was very clear that Mark never heard him. Mark had never followed Jesus himself, but he was actually a later disciple of Peter who was literally writing down or translating the oral tradition of Peter into a written form, and possibly even based on the word he used, could have been taking it from Aramaic to a written Greek, a verbal Aramaic to a written Greek. So Papias introduces us to this man, Mark, who there's no reason to bring him on the equation. He's not significant based on the testimony of Papias. He was not a direct eyewitness, but he was an interpreter for an eyewitness. So why not just call it the Gospel of Peter? If you're going to make this stuff up, just make it up and say the Gospel of Peter. It would go much better in trying to sell it. But what do you think originally here on the basis of the testimony of Papias using an illustration of Peter's gospel really being the Gospel of Mark?
Yeah, I think what's important to understand about Papias' statement is, first, he's relaying what he heard from the elder. Now, whether that be John, the elder, or the apostle, he's sourcing his information from those with knowledge. And he makes a couple of really good illustrations on how the gospel came to be, for the people of Rome. And I think there's some key points in there that he really touches on, that Mark was not given free reign or liberties in composing the account. He was only going to record what a scribe would tend to do, just what he had heard, to report accurately what he had counted. And I think the other part is it wasn't done so much in an orderly fashion, but remembering what Peter had preached. Peter is going around preaching to Rome. Obviously, he's probably preaching on different subjects. But the goal in mind was to put forth the account that he had heard Peter preach and bring it into a publication for the people of Rome. The key takeaways is, the scribe is not taking liberties to add in any false statements. He's only taken what he had heard from those that were in a position to tell it, this being Peter, and he had recounted what he had heard and remembered and putting to an account. So it's what he remembered from the accounts. It wasn't specifically in order. But the main thing there we take away with is he's getting this information from someone of authority within me. I'm thinking that's obviously John, the apostle. But the main thing is that there was nothing fabricated here. It's a direct eyewitness of someone with competent and relevant knowledge of the events, that he's taken down the account and publishing it for the people at Rome.
Going into the other side of that, Jonathan, you have Clement of Alexandria, for example. Clement seems to indicate to us, at least, that it was done while Peter was still alive. In fact, that's the exact words that he used. Most of what we're hearing from modern scholarship today is that Mark's gospel is the first gospel, which we'll talk about that more in a minute, but that it was 70 AD or later than that, 80, 85, which would indicate after Peter's death. So one of the earliest witnesses, which is late 2nd century, that states this particularly and explicitly, it's indicated obviously by Papias in his own statement. If he's interpreting Peter, Peter's there. He's speaking in a language as if Peter's saying something he's interpreting. But somebody who explicitly says the statement, Mark did this when Peter was alive, was Clement of Alexandria. What does somebody have to do in a situation like this to excuse an early testimony of somebody like Clement? And given the fact that Clement was in the same location that John Mark ended up going to be a bishop of after Peter's death.
Yeah, the question of the 70 it's pretty interesting on how they come about. What's interesting is John A.T. Robinson, another Anglican, he does really bring out the modern view of their approach to the after 70 mark. One of the things he does make pretty clear is that their chronology or their dating is really based more on presuppositions rather than hard facts or empirical foundation. So that's the first part. The second thing we need to understand is some of our earlier witnesses, not only Papias, but we do have Suetonius as well, that indicates that there was activity in Rome There was a dispute among the Jews, which eventually forced their expulsion from the area as a result of Christus. Now, this makes perfect sense in light of Papias' statement, because Peter is out there preaching all around Rome. Obviously, there's a big Jewish community inside of Rome that would obviously be very upset at this, which probably eventually led. But Peter going around preaching, it's going to have an effect on other people as well. Obviously, non-Christians, that being the Jews. And what we see is we not only have Papias' statement, but we have Clement's statement as well, that basically gives the same account. Now, there may be a couple of nuances there between his statement and Clement's, but we don't see no genuine issues of material fact there, because we have to explain, how did the church come into being? Peter's role there in helping organize the church, because by 57 AD, there's an active, vibrant church in Rome. And if we take the testimony of Papias along with Clement, and we see even the Roman author Suetonius reporting on activities as a result of this preaching of Christus that led to the Jews' expulsion, it explains a little more of what Papias is saying. That Peter's preaching obviously is going to be offensive to the Jews as they're gaining converts to the particular area.
Yeah, and it's consistent not only with these two. I mean, you have Irenaeus, you have Tertullian. In addition to that, you have Origen, the anti-Marcionite prologue, which goes so far as to describe the physical stature of Mark, calling him Stumpy Finger, but also saying the same thing. You have Jerome that comes in behind this. You have numerous individuals in the earliest parts of the witness of the church. And again, Clement of Alexandria was in the same location John Mark ended up going to after Peter's martyrdom. So Clement had very not only close ties in date, but region to where John Mark went. He was a bishop in the same area John Mark was a bishop. And so he had good information about the gospel account as well. But again, when we're looking at all these testimonies, Jonathan, we're not just saying, well, that's it. We have early testimonies. Oh, I think that is a major starting point. And I'm amazed at how quickly we go around that and call Christian bias and all this other, discussions of like, well, these guys had an agenda, conspiracy almost, without them flat out calling it a conspiracy. Is what it is. But these external evidences are good, but to just sit there and go, okay, well, it's not Mark and it wasn't Peter's gospel, this was after, and to pose a hypothesis that the writers were some unknown first century Christians or Christian or bishop is to condemn somebody as guilty without ever producing an actual person of interest or statement of interest. So you have, well, it's not Peter, it's not Mark. Well, then who is it? Well, just some second century, first century Christians, or it's like, okay, but what provenance? What bishop? Who did it? How did it get in there? See, what do you say about that? Because there seems to be, it's like, okay, well, we don't believe Clement, we don't believe Jerome, we don't believe Eusebius, we don't believe Irenaeus, Tertullian, or Papias. These guys are clearly pushing an agenda here. So it can't be them. It's got to be some random second century Christians. From a church ecclesiastical standpoint, is it even possible to push a gospel narrative in without apostolic authority? And the church is just to blindly take in letters and documents like Mark without knowing its origin and its authority? Is that even possible in a historical sense?
No, it can't be. I think Paul in Second Thessalonians, really makes this point about those who circulate letters claiming to be from him. Obviously, we see Tertullian, bringing up an account of, a presbyter at Ephesus trying to falsify a letter of Paul, trying to bring it into the congregation. He was disposed from the clergy as a result of that. You have Serapion, Bishop of Antioch, writing the Gospel of Peter, and these are men that are well aware of the affairs that are going on in the church. They're They were well aware of other letters being circulated under false pretenses, under other names that never got in. So to make a claim that after 70 AD, despite the safeguards that were put in place to preserve what had been handed down and to guard against this action that Paul is already aware of in 2 Thessalonians, is not historically consistent with what we're seeing happening within the ecclesiastical churches. So, and you brought up a good point. What's the point of reference? Who is this person of interest after 70 AD that would have had the means to infiltrate a church that was underground? I mean, Christianity did not have, was not a recognized religion of Rome. As a result, they had to operate underground. So who would have been able to circumvent that system if they weren't part of the churches already? So it would have had to have apostolic authority. And what we see from, Eusebius, what we see from, Papias and Clement, Eusebius says that Peter had authorized the writings of Mark to be read. And we do see that consistent theme that the apostles were authorizing these works to be read in the churches. Which goes back to our argument that there was oversight. And I know you brought up about the Council of Jerusalem before. There was a governing body overseeing and laying down evangelical precepts for the church. So there was a very well-structured and ordered system. Someone outside of that office would not be able to accomplish that particular event.
Yeah, and so with that, once more, it's easy to excuse a person of interest. That is not disputed, may we both add. Peter being behind it's not disputed. Mark being the interpreter and writer is not disputed. There is no second name of interest that's been brought up. Historically, there's zero. There is nobody else. The only thing that can be stated is some anonymous, unknown area, person, and writer or group issued and published an account of Jesus' ministry that the churches throughout the world accepted. And that's a little bit far-fetched. And now we get accused of far-fetched ideas. To me, that's far-fetched. If we're in a court of law, that would not work. That kind of argument would not work. Well, so we bring a person of interest, we bring some evidence, we claims, eyewitnesses, people that are saying they talked to these people, that knew the people, and that stuff's excused. It's like, well, who do you have? Well, who's your person of interest? Well, we don't have a name. That wouldn't work in most, or a place, or a bishop, or a church, or a location, or a time, or it's ambiguous. It's just, well, it's got to be post 70. But the problem is what they'll argue, Jonathan, is, well, there's no internal evidence for your claim. All you have is external evidence. And one of the things that I appreciated about Bauckham, although I don't agree with everything that Bauckham said, he's a wonderful writer and very detailed in his approach, especially in the Johannine writings. Another Anglican, should I add. But in the book he wrote, the Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, he made the comment that when you're looking at the internal evidence, it's not as lopsided as people always make it out to be. So talking about Mark, for example, he has the highest frequency of any reference of Peter than any other gospel. So when we're looking for clues internally, not just externally, what are the evidences that point to the fact that Peter could have been the author behind the account? Well, he's referenced more than anybody in those, like when you're comparing Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, his highlight is definitely Mark's gospel. It contains Petrine inclusio eyewitnesses. We talked about that going through Baukham's technique of showing how in first century writings, how you would include yourself in the narrative, you'd give yourself a credit as an authority or as the eyewitness who's supplying the information at the beginning and at the end, and how you would include yourself in the narratives. And he demonstrated that by the plural to singular narrative device, which Cuthbert Turner had posted an article in 1925 about, and demonstrated how often in Mark's gospel, including in the places it was consistent with Luke and Matthew, Where there's the plural starting out, they went and did this, and it ended with the singular. He got off the boat. Jesus got off the boat. And I gave numerous examples of that, where you see the plural verb without an explicit subject being used, describing the movement of Jesus and disciples, and followed immediately by a singular verb or pronoun referring to Jesus alone. And then there was other areas too, like when it came to Peter, he seemed to always be the guy that's highlighted. He's the one speaking on behalf of the group of the apostles in the Gospel of Mark. Very different. Now, in times he does that in the other synoptics, but frequently in Mark's Gospel, the disciples are speaking, but only Mark's only recording Peter doing it. There's also times where the audience is being addressed, meaning Jesus is talking to the entire group of the disciples, but he only records Peter being called out, but yet he's referring to the whole group. And we gave examples of that in the story of the Garden of Gethsemane. And then you see where it's both, like he's addressing the whole group, and yet Peter's speaking as if he's speaking on behalf of the whole group, and Peter is talking on behalf of the whole group, and Jesus is addressing the whole group, but yet he's talking to Peter. And over again, it's like, why? This is bad writing if that's really the way this is going, because he's addressing a plural group but talking to a singular man, and the singular man is talking on behalf of a plural group all the time in the Gospel of Mark. Very different from Luke and Matthew. So again, we looked at some of these examples that Peter's perspective was in these narratives, like Peter's motives were being disclosed. How would anybody else know what he was thinking or what was in his heart, like we see in chapter 9, verse 5 through 6, and chapter 14, verse 54 through 72. Peter is the main person who drives the narrative. His acknowledgement of the person of Jesus as being the Messiah, the Christ, really changed the perplexity of the book. His denial of Christ in public changed the perplexity of the book. His actions were seemingly the direction of the narrative of the ministry of Jesus. He is without a doubt the one that is driving the narrative in the book more than any other apostle. In fact, most apostles aren't mentioned at all outside of himself and a few others in passing. And it's Peter's understanding and misunderstandings of Jesus that set the tone for the narratives in the book. So we see all these. He's gaining knowledge of the resurrection. He's being recorded as the one that's being highlighted at the empty tomb more so. We see the inclusio of him being the first apostle on the scene, and the ending, he's the last one on the scene. So what do you think about the internal witness too, that we spent numerous examples of, that we just for the sake of time couldn't go through all of, showing that this isn't just an external thing. There is internal reason to believe that Peter was behind this gospel.
Yeah, and I think you highlighted some key passages in here. And remember, part of the external testimony helps explain and amplify the internal evidence. So obviously, Mark, who is a hearer, gathering the information from Peter's sermon, who he's preaching. It's interesting, like we find in Mark 11, then Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look. So we see more of those references that Peter is addressing people. And this is one of the things that he brought about. Even where you were bringing, Peter's personal references to Jesus, he was hungry in 11:12, and when they went to the place called Gethsemane, and he said, so this is indicative of a person out there preaching, giving his own personal eyewitness testimony or his vantage point of what he's seeing. And I think that was one of my biggest takeaways when you were really describing the internal evidence, is you're really setting the scene for, what's being written down is coming from this kind of preaching pulpit. And it makes sense because Peter, on his authority as an eyewitness, would speak in that manner to the people of Rome, and the hearer, Mark being the scribe, would collect that information as he had recorded, which is consistent with the testimonies of Papias and Clement, Irenaeus, Tertullian. So throughout, the common history is the same. So because we have all these that are independently sourced. I mean, Papias is saying he's getting it from the elders. We have Clement saying he's getting it from the elders over in Alexandria. Eusebius going to external documents as well. So they're all individually sourced, and they're coming up with the same history. And internally, we see everything consistent with that case. So they're consistent with each other. Obviously, if the internal evidence did not portray that, that'd be a different conversation. But this is obviously a person that's preaching to the people, giving his testimony. And obviously, if you're there, we're going to see more references to Peter's narrative from his vantage point. And I think you really showcased that really well.
Yeah, and we even showed parallels where it wasn't that case in Luke, or it wasn't that case in Matthew. Mm-hmm. So with that, let's swing over to Matthew, because that one was fun. In fact, I had probably the most feedback email-wise from Matthew's gospel. Some of it was hate mail. Some of it was like, what are you talking about? Like that, I've never heard that before. It's like, well, that doesn't mean it's not true. But looking at Matthew's gospel, the part that threw everybody off is that Matthew's gospel is early attested by Papias and others that the original version that was circulating in the churches was a Hebrew or Aramaic dialect version of Matthew's gospel. And what Papias said this, therefore Matthew put the sayings, or the logia, in an ordered arrangement. And by the way, that's in comparison to what he was saying about Mark, whereas Mark was not putting them, like Mark just recorded what Peter said. It wasn't in a particular order. And you can kind of see the order differences when you look at them side by side. Mm-hmm. And so it's not an error for Mark. These are oral traditions. Peter wasn't preaching sermons necessarily to be chronological. He was getting to the content purposes and the meat of the stories. But Matthew, on the other hand, by comparison, Papias is saying, put it in an ordered arrangement in the Hebrew dialect, but each person interpreted same word, which I think is the idea of translating them as best as he could. And there was different reasons to accept, because Irenaeus said the same thing. He said that, and I actually used this for my dating of the Gospel of Matthew in Greek. He says, Matthew is indeed among the Hebrews in their own dialect, wrote a gospel while Peter and Paul were evangelizing in Rome. We see the consistency even with Bartholomew was recorded as being in the areas of India, mm-hmm. where apparently he had been there early on, and Christians come over later to bring the gospel, and they find out, oh, wow, these people already have the gospel, and they have it in Matthew's gospel. And they had it in Hebrew, or as, again, it could be Aramaic, depending on how you view that. Origen said the same thing, that and we're going to talk about one of his statements in a second, but he said the same thing. The first gospel was written according to Matthew. He published it for those who left Judaism in the Hebrew language. And again, we go on and on. Eusebius said the same thing. Jerome said the same thing. They're all saying the same thing. Matthew's gospel was first published in Hebrew Aramaic. And so that poses an interesting problem, because all we know of that is later transmitted text in pretty much the Syrian areas where they have 5th century manuscripts of it in their language. But again, it's not just Matthew's in that language. They have all the gospels in that language, mm-hmm. going through the Peshitta. But when you're talking about actual copies, all we can really go off of in history is Jerome and some of his dialogue and discussion with those who wanted things with the Ebionites and things like that. So let's park right there and say, okay, we do have an attestation of all the fathers claiming this was originally done in the Hebrew dialect. What do you think about that when it comes to Matthew's claims, or those that claim those things about Matthew himself?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. First, Eusebius does say that Matthew and John, they kind of wrote of necessity. And I think focusing on Matthew first, there's a couple of audiences. He's primarily writing to a Jewish audience, for his fellow countrymen. And if you think about it, the language of the Jews at that time, was Aramaic. Well, Hebrew was still being spoken in the temple. They were still using, predominantly, they were using Aramaic. So it made sense when we talk about, we have churches in Jerusalem. And one of the interesting things or statements from Hippolytus at Rome was that, Matthew had published his gospel to Jerusalem. So it was published there. It was published in the areas of Judea, the churches that we had there. Antioch, one of the first Christian churches. What we see over there is obviously there's a Greek audience there. There's also an Aramaic. And when we see with Bartholomew bringing the gospel according to Matthew to the Indians, that's another Aramaic area. So when Papias goes over to India, he sees that the gospel of Matthew had already arrived in the Hebrew or in the Hebrew letters or Aramaic. So he makes an empirical observation that the Gospel of Matthew is there. It's consistent what we find from Bartholomew bringing it there. So my first observation is there was a need for an Aramaic Matthew. I think there was a group of people, obviously in India, obviously in Judea. Obviously, they spoke Greek there as well, but there was a large Aramaic population that would have fit a need. Antioch, there would have been a need over in for Syriac. So, when I look at it, there was a very early need for an Aramaic version, whether Matthew was using his Greek notes to translate it. I know there's a long-standing tradition in the Aramaic churches that their Matthew is the original, and they kind of fight tooth and nail to that. While I do agree with you, I believe the Matthew we have is from the Greek. I do think there was a need for a very early Aramaic version of Matthew to be circulated for those people. You had churches in Jerusalem, Antioch, all over Judea, Samaria, India. And so it did serve a need for that. So whether the Greek was first or the Aramaic, I think there was a need for an early Aramaic translation for those groups that I mentioned.
Yeah, and I think that indicates that Matthew was very early, because the earliest audience the church reached was Jewish predominantly until they spread into the Gentile world, which is why I believe it was necessitated eventually for Matthew to be published in Greek. Now, you and I do hold a different position here. You believe that Matthew published two gospels that were the same at the same time, one Greek, one Aramaic or Hebrew. I actually believe that the Greek version of Matthew's gospel has differences and that it was published later. And I think that is the witness of Irenaeus, who said it happened while Peter and Paul were evangelizing in Rome. And based on the missionary journeys of Paul, he and Peter could not have been in the area except for after 58 up to their martyrdoms. And so I think that Matthew's gospel was a group effort gospel, whereas the Hebrew version would have been more of his records of Jesus's ministry while together. And the reason I say this is, I'm just not making up out of thin air, because Jerome actually states individual content that was in that Hebrew version that he had received information from in the Caesarean library. One of them was a story of Jesus appearing to his brother, James the Just, after the resurrection, which, by the way, is consistent with what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, that the resurrected Jesus appeared to James. But we don't actually have a record of that in the four gospels that we have today. But it could be that that was based on an early circulated account that Matthew recorded, and Paul was utilizing that. So I do think, and I actually got an email about this, and I need to clarify something because it was misunderstood. I'm not saying they're on two different worlds. Like, oh, the Hebrew version was this weird, totally different transmitted of Jesus's teachings recorded. And then on the other hand, the Greek was, no, what I'm saying is what was probably in that Hebrew version was closer to the Matthean material, Matthew's personal eyewitness collected account. I think his Greek version was published later with the surrounding eyewitness accounts of utilizing both the Gospel of Mark, because I do believe Matthew is the first gospel in the Hebrew and Aramaic. Mark is the first Greek gospel, and Matthew's is actually third when you're looking at the Greek. I think it's Matthew Hebrew, Mark Greek, Luke Greek, Matthew Greek, John. Again, that's my personal opinion. I believe that's the way it went. I think Luke's gospel was before Matthew's Greek gospel, but I believe Matthew was utilizing an apostolic eyewitness. I think his gospel was the one that was launched from Jerusalem, whereas Luke would have been launched from the area of Greece, which is what we see in testimony. We'll talk about him in a minute. But the official gospel that would have been launched from the apostles from Antioch and Jerusalem, I believe, was Matthew's, and it was officially sent by the apostolic main churches like in Antioch and Jerusalem. And the reason I say that is because of the Didache. And it does quote Luke, but Matthew's 25 times minimum, and maybe even up to 30. And that's a lot for a letter the size of the Didache. And they did not call it the Gospel of Matthew. They called it the Gospel of the Lord. So it seems to be a group efforted account that was combining eyewitness accounts. And so let's just say that Matthew is after Mark, Greek-wise. People have this idea, well, Matthew's longer than Mark, so obviously this is an expanded story. It's like, time out. Like, why do we automatically run to that narrative? Even if you believe Matthew is second to Mark or third to Mark, it doesn't mean that these stories were getting worse and more. It could be that Matthew was an apostle utilizing the eyewitness testimony of Peter. I mean, Peter is a star witness. He was in places with Jesus. Matthew wasn't. Why wouldn't he use Peter's testimony in record? Why wouldn't he follow some of the systematic layouts that Peter did? But there's also times where Matthew doesn't follow the systematic layouts that Mark does, and he goes in a totally different direction than Mark did. For example, the stories of Jesus on the Olivet Discourse are not in the same way recorded. It is by Luke, not Mark. The Sermon on the Mount is not recorded by Peter. It is recorded by Mark. So to say, well, they're just copying each other and building, well, no, I mean, that's not consistent either. So I do believe that, and I know we differ here, and you can share your opinion, and it's okay to differ. We're fine with differing opinions because we're all wrong anyway. But I mean, we might as well share our differences here. But I do think that there is something to the fact that Matthew did have the first original gospel in his own way of sharing his eyewitness testimony, but it was actually finalized and published by the entire group of apostolic testimony back in Antioch and Jerusalem later in history. What's your thoughts? Share your opinion. Give us 2 minutes, and I'm going to pull up some comments so we can actually stick here. There's some statements made in the audience I want you to hear. But go ahead and give about a 2-minute layout of your opinion. Tell me why I'm wrong, and then I'll come back and tell you why you're wrong, and then we'll go from there.
Well, I think first and foremost, I do have to deal with the statements of, Jerome, Origen, Clement in some respects, saying the genealogy is the first, Eusebius, Irenaeus. They all identify Matthew as the first evangelist. I'll bring up Jerome in a second regarding what he found at Caesarea. But I think in reference to, so laying the foundation there, they all identify him as first. They don't identify any difference between the Matthews that they're referring to that are in their churches, in their Greek churches, and the one that Matthew published. Hippolytus does say he published it to Jerusalem. It was brought to India. I think the only thing that Pantheus observes is that it's just in Hebrew characters or Aramaic, and that church, part of the Aramaic churches, they use the Peshitta, or they have that, and that's basically the same Matthew that we see today. So on that standing, I would say there was a very early need. I would agree with you that Matthew was in Greek. The Aramaic translation is from the Greek. But there was a very early need in Judea, in India, and in Dessa, where they went to, where they would have needed a very early translation into Aramaic for those particular churches. And we're seeing that the Gospel of Matthew being distributed very early on. Bartholomew had already brought it, which shows how early it was. I just see no difference now. Jerome's comment on some of the quotes that he did, and I'll just finish up with this point. Obviously, he's going to Caesarea. He did not go to the Aramaic churches. What he found there, was it representative of, what Papias saw in India and what they had over in Edessa? I'm not sure. He didn't source it from there. He sourced it from something in Caesarea. Obviously, it would have been better if he got it from Edessa. But he still didn't indicate there was anything materially different between the Aramaic and the Hebrew that became part of the Latin Vulgate. But once again, I'm not against your position. There's sound reasoning and logic to it. This is just how I approach the data.
Sure. And see, and I actually received an email after Matthew and said, so you're going against the testimony of all the church fathers. And I said, well, how do you figure that? They said, because you put Matthew in the 60s. I said, well, actually, the fathers never really talk about the Greek version. They emphasize the Aramaic Hebrew. So I'm not going against them. I'm actually saying what they're saying. I'm saying it's justifiable that the mathematics of comparing the internal evidence, where it seems like Matthew would follow the pattern of Mark in most cases, is consistent, and the testimony is consistent, because I do believe Matthew was first in Hebrew and Aramaic. So when people say, are you Matthean or Mark? Are you Mark in priority? I go, it depends what way you're asking me that question. If you're talking about order of published texts that were apostolic, I would say I'm Matthean, because I believe there was a published Aramaic Hebrew version. When it comes to the Greek texts that were fully accepted as the testaments of the churches, I believe it's Mark. So I'd be Markan. So we're kind of I meet you in the middle, and I meet the other group in the middle, and I say, can't we all just be friends? I mean, that's pretty much what I'm doing. I'm just trying to bring the two worlds together, call it compromise, call it whatever you want. But it would indicate this question that's come up, and you should be able to see it on the screen, Jonathan, from Pritchard Studios. It says, facts. Do you think Matthew's gospel, originally being in Hebrew Aramaic, is the reason he quotes from the MT or the Hebrew far more exclusively even than the Septuagint, like the other gospels tend to do? And I think and I brought this up before in the recent past. I do believe that is evidenced in the fact that Matthew seems to be doing his own little translation from the Hebrew. When you look at the Greek, and I gave numerous examples of this in the internal evidence, when you go to the Greek, he's not following the Septuagint in most places. At times it seems consistent, but again, you're translating it. It's going to come out somewhat the same. Luke is definitely quoting the Septuagint. I mean, there is no dispute, no doubt about it. Matthew seems to kind of go on his own at times. And so it does indicate that there was a Hebrew text, New Testament, before there actually was the Greek, and that is evidenced in that. And I gave examples, Jonathan, in the second presentation of Matthew that I did. I gave internal evidence when it came to the purity of Hebrew terms. Like, he had to translate concepts, like you will call his name Jesus, because in Greek it's Iesu. That doesn't have the punch that it does in Hebrew, indicating Joshua or salvation. So what does Matthew do there? He translates it for the Greek reader. He says, because he will save his people from their sins. So it loses its punch if you just say, and they called his name Jesus. In Greek, that doesn't have any relevance as it would if you're saying it to a Hebrew audience, as it's indicated. I gave concepts of the idea of Matthew chapter 2, that he was called a Nazarene. and how that would have been a prophecy, not of one specific specific prophet, but it was actually play on words that characterized Hebrew phraseology. And even looking at the Greek term tate, which is often an Aramaic origin when you're using written traditions, and it appeared 90 plus times in Matthew and only 6 in Mark, 14 in Luke. In the same places, 50 of those are synoptic accounts, meaning they're reading the same story, but in 50 of those 90, only Matthew starts it out with that Aramaic origin. And again, we used multiple like idioms like good eye versus bad eye. The good eye is a Jewish idiom of generosity. And one of the biggest ones for me was at the Council of Jamnia. And you see this in Josephus's writings. And I want you to chime in on this one specifically, Jonathan. At the Council of Jamnia, the term Israel is really a consistent early first century verbiage. In modern readers of that time would have seen it more that way. But after about 80 AD at the Council of Jamnia, that terminology became extinct and used more so in the sense of the Jews. And I gave examples that Matthew used Israel 12 times, John only 4. And Matthew used Jews 5 times, John used it 65 times, which again is consistent with Josephus's writings in the 90s. And I gave an example where Matthew only used Jews in reference to when he was quoting a Gentile speaking. But when the Jews were speaking, it was clearly Israel, the descendants of Abraham. Here's the example, and you can chime in. Matthew 27:29. They, that's the governor's soldiers, twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and placed his staff in his right hand, knelt down before him, mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." So you have Gentiles saying it. Same chapter, a few verses later, he saved others, but he cannot save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross. We, being the chief priests, scribes, and elders, will believe in him. So when the Jews are speaking, it's Israel. When the Gentiles are speaking, it's Jews, indicating once more that this would be pre-Jamnia terminology, just understanding Hebrew statements of Jew versus Israel. So with some of those examples, chime in a little bit here to answer the question that our friend in the chat has asked about, do you think this translating Hebrew stuff is indicators that the Hebrew was before the Greek translation of Matthew?
Well, first, that was a great point that you had brought up with the Council of Jamnia, because it shows a turning point, phraseology and usage of words that obviously we're finding in Matthew very early. Obviously, he's writing to those people, so he obviously wants to use phraseology that's common and consistent that they would identify with. Obviously, if he was writing much afterwards, the terminology, so there's a point of date reference on there too. But I think there's a couple of points there. Obviously, first, he's not using the Septuagint, which would not be known to the Jewish audience. Now, remember, Luke, who is going to the Septuagint, he's writing to the Gentile converts. And remember, the Septuagint had been in their Hellenistic history for a while. So that would be something that they would have been very familiar with. And that's why we see Luke quoting it. Same thing with Matthew, but on the other end, to the audience that it's directed to. And that's why we see the basis for establishing a very early Aramaic Hebrew edition for the Jewish people, something that they can resonate and identify with. Obviously, if he's using the Septuagint, they wouldn't be aware of that. Obviously, it makes a lot of sense for the Gentile converts with Luke. That's the audience that Paul is going out to, and the audience that he's addressing in Judea, Samaria, and having this work distributed, having a very early, really bears testimony on your thesis there. So it does make sense.
And one of my favorite examples was that Matthew assumed his audience understood Jewish customs. And I gave the comparison between Mark chapter 7, verses 3 through 4, with Matthew 15, 1 through 3. And it was the statement about how Mark had to clarify the cleansing of utensils and stuff, because this was a debate between Rabbi Hillel and Shammai, whereas Matthew assumed his audience knew the debate. Mark went on to explain to a bunch of people in Rome why this was important. For example, it says in Mark's gospel, for the Pharisees and all the Jews did not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, keeping the tradition of the elders. When they came from the marketplace, they did not eat unless they'd washed, and there are many other customs they received and keep, like the washing of cups, pitchers, kettles, and dining couches. That is not stated in Matthew's gospel. So again, if Matthew's just copying Mark here, and poor guy doesn't know what he's doing, he's just forging all kinds of stuff and stealing copyrights. Why is it that Mark actually is the extended version here? Matthew's the shorter version, because Matthew, writing about ceremonial cleansing to a bunch of Jews in Judea, they understand what the argument is. A bunch of guys in Rome are like, what's cleaning pots and couches? What's that all about? They don't understand. They're Gentiles. They don't have Jewish customs. So Mark made sure, writing to a Gentile audience, hey, this is why this happened. You need to understand the history. Matthew just goes on assuming. So again, these are indicators that he's not just copying. Actually, they're writing to their respected audiences. So we do see indications of Jewish understanding that's assumed in Matthew's gospel that is not assumed in Mark's.
No, that's it. That was a really good illustration. So I like how you put the divorce debate and
divorce. Yep.
Something that they would identify, something that was common disputes that they can all relate to. And obviously, Peter preaching at Rome, you're going to have to explain a little more detail of what's happening over here. So, no, that was a great observation.
He said, fascinating. Thank you for discussing the question. And also, if you've missed those, please go back and watch them. They're on YouTube, Facebook, and they're also on Spotify if you want to hear the audio. We went into much detail. In fact, I pulled up the graphs and actually showed it in comparison. So if you want to go back and watch the video, make sure to do that. Nick threw in a comment here. Beza stated that the Syriac was worthy of the highest authority. Well, they certainly thought so as well. Again, as you said, Jonathan, they believe that they had the original version. Yeah. They're hell bent on that.
Yeah, no, and it does go back to, Thaddeus going out there to Edessa, Bartholomew going out there to India. So these are Aramaic speaking areas where they would have needed that. And that's why they reverence that edition as the most authoritative. That's the only one they believe that they have known that has come down to them. And they believe, we have the original Aramaic version of Matthew. So while I believe that's a separate issue, the debate over which language was it published in first, I still believe it's when I look at the Peshitta, when I look at Jerome's Vulgate, we basically see the same Matthew between both editions, from the Greek that he's translated from.
And you and I don't differ on one thing that needs to be understood. We differ perhaps on how it laid itself out in history. We don't differ on whether these are based on eyewitness accounts. No, and we certainly don't. We don't believe they copied each other. Like, well, we just don't know what to do here. We're just going to steal some information and build on it. Like,
let's just no. I think that's a good point, because I think sometimes people, what are the different? No, Steve and I both agree on the fundamentals. These are eyewitness accounts. This wasn't witness tampering or collusion between the writers, where they're stealing material, they're trying to propagate a narrative that didn't really happen. So let me just extrapolate from this author. Let me just start making up some things. So that's why I thought your point on Mark actually explaining out those differences, where Matthew's showing the shorter, really goes to the effect that Matthew's not really an amplification of Mark. They're writing to their vantage points and the people that they're addressing. I think one point that doesn't bring up when we see Latin literature, and this kind of fits the construct of Peter's preaching to Rome, they wouldn't want something long and lengthy. We see this with the Greeks. They write on forever in all these volumes. The Latin, they want something short and sweet and to the point. And that's why I kind of like Mark. It's right to the point. It doesn't beat around the bush.
I agree. And I think that the evidence is there. And again, what I'm saying along with Jonathan is we're not ignoring internal evidence as we've been accused, like, oh, well, they're just stating church fathers and keeping their bias on that. It's like, no, what they're claiming is that there was a document written for a certain group at a certain time to certain people. And again, when you're looking at the data, it's internally consistent with the claims. We're not claiming, it's not like we have a position where the church fathers say one thing and the internal evidence is on another world. We actually say that their claims are consistent with the internal evidence. And these are examples of that. And again, we're in a short show. If we did a 4-hour segment, we could go from chapter 1 all the way to the end. But just keeping it short, that's the best way to do it, is to get the highlights and the biggest ones. Psalm 23 apologetic says, I haven't seen Jonathan Sheffield in a while. Good to see him too. He has been hiding. That's the answer. He's been in hiding. He's been in a cave studying for his debate coming up, which we'll mention here at the end. Slam RN, these are two of my fave. We're not favorites, just fave guys. So appreciate the feedback there. And agreed, yes. Slam, please share to this channel. Get more exposure, share the videos with friends or skeptics. We're not afraid of challenges and emails. Numerous emails come in every single week from this show, and I appreciate those who have questions, feedback, or pushback. We welcome it, obviously, in kind spirit. We want to have that. Let's go to Luke. Let's finish up here. Luke's gospel. And I'm biased. I will admit this on live stream videos. I am extremely biased. Luke's my favorite gospel. It's especially in the synoptic realm as well. But one of the things that I focused on, Jonathan, externally on Luke's gospel was not so much the church fathers, except for later, because of the two early accounts of the anti-Marcionite prologue and the Muratorian fragment, where I took the testimony of both. And just for the sake of argument, I'm going to read out loud the anti-Marcionite prologue and the Muratorian and give my summary, and then you can jump in with me here. It says, indeed, Luke was Antiochian Syrian, a doctor by profession, a disciple of the apostles. Later, however, he followed Paul until his martyrdom, serving the Lord blamelessly. He never had a wife. He never fathered children, and died at the age of 84, full of the Holy Spirit and Boyce. Therefore, although the gospel had already been written, indeed, by Matthew in Judea, Mark in Italy. So this is claiming Luke is the third. Again, Mark in Italy being Rome, and Matthew being written to the Jews. Again, I'm not disputing that. I still believe that's true, even if you hold a Mark in priority and accept that there was an early circulation. Again, I'm not in opposition to this, as I've been accused of. I'm saying it's still possible to hold Mark in priority and believe these words. Moved by the Holy Spirit, he wrote down this gospel in part of Achaia, and indeed afterward, the same Luke wrote the Acts of the Apostles. That's the anti-Marcionite prologue, 2nd and 3rd century. And then the Muratorian fragment, one of the earliest witnesses of lists of books in our New Testament, which would be almost a cataloged version of canonical books. It's not complete, and it's not fully what we would say is canonical, but it was one of the earliest attempts to collect a list. And in it, it says the third book of the gospel, again, indicating Luke came after Mark and Matthew, is that according to Luke, the well-known physician, after the ascension of Christ, when Paul had taken with him a companion of his traveling, composed it in his own name. And according to the general belief, yet he himself had not seen the Lord in the flesh, and therefore he was able to ascertain events. So indeed, he begins to tell the story of the birth of John. And so my summary of all this was, Luke was a well-known physician. He was a follower of Paul and a companion that traveled with him. He composed a gospel in his name while he was traveling with Paul, not after his death, but while he was traveling with him. He was not an eyewitness, which is very consistent, and his writing was based on his ability to discover and research the events beginning at John the Baptist all the way to the resurrection. And so my hypothesis of a date just on those two documents, if we had no other history, we had no other work, we set aside internal church father testimony just on these two documents. We laid it out this way. He started traveling with Paul around 50 to 52 AD. Just read Acts chapter 16, verse 10. The Muratorian fragment states that he wrote this while he was traveling with Paul. So that's our starting line, somewhere beginning there. The anti-Marcionite prologue says it took place in the area of Achaia, which Paul took numerous trips there, but in a few of his trips, Luke was not there throughout the testimony of Acts. The main time frame would be around Acts 19 because he started traveling with Paul around Acts 16. So this is around 55 to 56 AD. It's here that Paul likely wrote the book of 2 Corinthians, and Luke and Titus delivered this letter of 2 Corinthians to the church, but he was also writing the Gospel of Luke. This timeline would work with Luke's gaining proper documentation from the apostles and the other eyewitnesses in Jerusalem and Antioch, because in his travel with Paul in Acts 18, he spent almost a year with Paul and those in Antioch and Jerusalem that were eyewitnesses for almost a year. It would have given him time around 52 to 53 AD to collect the data to compile eyewitnesses that were around the ministry of Jesus in those main locations and to build that documentation up to the time of 55 to 56, which would also be consistent with the testimony of the early fathers who state that when Paul used the phrase, according to my gospel, he was referring to Luke's gospel. And this is referenced by Eusebius, going back to phrases in Romans chapter 2, being the earliest of it in verse 16, which if Romans was written around 57, 58, that means Luke's gospel was fresh off the press, so to speak, when he was saying, according to my gospel. So he is utilizing, based on these testimonies, one could conclude that Gospel of Luke was written around 55 to 56 AD if we just follow the Muratorian fragment and the anti-Marcionite prologue. What's your thoughts about that hypothesis that I presented a few weeks ago?
No, I think it's pretty consistent with the historical records. I think first, Paul going out to the Gentiles, those converts, he obviously needed a gospel to preach to. So, and once again, you bring up Eusebius and Jerome, obviously two different historians reporting on the same event. That's consistent with what we find in the Muratorian fragment and the anti-Marcion prologue as well. So we see the common history throughout, from a court historian, from the secretary of the Pope Damascus, the Muratorian fragment. They're all consistent. Obviously, Paul needed a gospel to preach to the Gentile converts that he was reaching, and which goes back to your earlier point on the audience he is addressing. Why is he referring more to the Septuagint? Because that is something that they would have been much more familiar with. We see this even in Romans, Paul's references to the Septuagint, because obviously it was primarily a Gentile church, even though there's some Jews there too, but it was primarily a Gentile church. So that seems very consistent with the historical record, because with dating Paul's ministry between 51 and 57, 58 AD, obviously he had a gospel available to him that they all identify that Paul is referring to as his gospel that he was using in the preaching. So I think that's pretty accurate with the historic accounts, that this would have been completed, distributed to the churches to have, which means obviously he does reference the other ones. Matthew and Mark would have had to been in circulation by that time, that he was aware of, that obviously preceded the churches that they possibly would have had by them that they were visiting. So it seems right on point with the historical records.
Well, let's back up into Matthew and Luke on these two elements. So we just talked about both of them from a historical side, and even demonstrating that Matthew would have been using Hebrew idioms, phraseology, etc. But the claims also of these two guys particularly is that Matthew was the publican, the tax collector, and Luke was a physician. And every single person said that Luke was a physician. And the Muratorian fragment went so far as to say he was a well-known physician, not just any. So let's back up to Matthew, and then we'll wrap up maybe these last few minutes. And by the way, this program, we like to keep our programs under an hour. Every now and then we'll have a special program like this that extends past that because we have two people talking instead of one. So just keep that in mind. Some of you may be like, whoa, we're at the hour 4-minute mark here. Yeah, we do go over on programs like this where we bring guests on. Going to Matthew, for example, we talked about what would a tax collector's gospel look like. In the layout, a tax collector would have known multiple languages. He's keeping records. He's keeping official records of the people, which means he would have had to know multiple languages. Certainly, he would have been familiar with Aramaic. And I demonstrated how he knew Aramaic phraseology and was using Aramaic in places the other gospels didn't, like in Matthew 5:22, Matthew 27:46, and others. And obviously, he knew Greek. He wrote the entire Gospel of Matthew is written in Greek, or at least translated into Greek. So Matthew would have known Greek as a tax collector and Hebrew. And we gave numerous illustrations of Hebrew idioms and phraseology that only Jews would have known. There's no doubt he had the language side of it down. Also, he would have had to have information of tax laws. And this is where I want you to chime in on this. 14 times in Matthew's gospel, taxes are mentioned. 12 in Luke, 5 in Mark, a big fat 0 in John. Taxes are mentioned. So Matthew is the most, and again, Luke has quite a few too, but Luke's longer than Matthew. But Matthew is 14 to John 0. And again, if he's just borrowing a bunch of stuff from Mark, Mark's at, the lowly little 5. But Matthew's the only one that even tells the story of the temple tax. The only one that even mentions this in Matthew chapter 17, verse 24.
Yeah, and I think this is key, when we're looking at the different vantage points that the writers are referencing. Obviously, you're speaking to your expertise. And something as special as the temple tax that a lot may have not even been familiar with. But obviously, Matthew's a tax collector that would have kept books for the Roman Empire on recording all this. He would have been well informed, just like good bookkeeper or CFO or controller. They're going to understand these specific details. So this is where you see him speaking from his expertise, something that he was able to relate. And that's why Matthew 17, does your teacher pay the temple tax, gives very specific. And I think you pointing out in Matthew that, he's referencing it 14 times, and, we see John, there's 0 usage in it. Which really speaks to his expertise. And then you do the same thing with Luke, from a historian, from a physician standpoint, what do we expect to find that's characteristic of their professions? Because remember, they're seeing it from their vantage point, and it speaks to how they see the world in their writings. Obviously, as a bookkeeper for the Roman Empire, these are things that he's going to be very observant of. And this is why we see this in the writings.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I think Nick kind of chimes in on some of that. Nick says publicans were seen as like magistrates, tax collector, while an okay translation does limit the full scope of a publican, and etymological study is interesting. So again, I agree with you, Jonathan. I think that when we're talking about his skill set, he would have been aware of things that Peter would not have cared about. And again, if Peter's gospel, if Matthew is copying him, why in the world is he putting the story in here? Peter clearly didn't want to deal with the reality of the passage. I mean, it's not that Peter wouldn't have known. In fact, it involved Peter when Matthew's writing it, but it wouldn't have been no interest to Peter. Maybe Peter's a little bitter and doesn't like the taxes, but Matthew had a great interest. This is something he would have been very familiar with. On the other hand, Luke or John would not care. Another example that was brought up was his ability to deal with legal transactions. So if you're a tax collector, you're going to understand legal work, legal purchases, especially within Rome or as it relates to the temple itself. And I brought up the fact in Matthew chapter 27, verses 3-7, Judas returned the 30 pieces of silver to the religious leaders. And I mentioned the fact that Matthew would have been a Levite, and these regulations would have been important to him, and likely being formally acquainted with many of the tax collectors in his day, he could have gotten this information from them, because nobody was there with Judas describing what happened when that lot of land was purchased, the blood money that was given, and the chief priest would not put it into the treasury. There was legal laws there from Torah and ethical laws there too. So they would have purchased this land and bought that potter's field with it, and it became a burial place for foreigners. That would have been a great interest to Matthew, because he's a tax collector, legal transactions. He'd have been friends with people who knew of purchases and properties and taxes and things like that. He would have been able to get access to that before Luke ever could have, or Peter for that matter. So indicators like that too show that he had legal access or knowledge. And then even the gospel writer of Matthew gives the epithet accompanying the name Matthew, which the others do not. Meaning in Matthew chapter 10, he gives the list, Matthew the tax collector, going back to Matthew chapter 9, making sure you understand he's the one that was told to come and follow me from the tax collecting table. The other two gospel accounts do refer to him, but as Levi. And when mentioning him the name of the 12, he's just Matthew without the extra additional epithet.
And I like that. This has been educational for me as well. I think I picked up on a lot of really good illustrations about the characteristics of who they are that's writing the accounts. But I thought that was a very subtle way of Matthew identifying with the epithet. This is who I am. I'm not just Matthew. I am Matthew's a tax collector. I think it was really a subtle way of making that distinction as to status and who I am that we only find in his gospel, which is consistent with the historical account of Matthew the Levite is the one that brought this account into publication. So I think it's very consistent with the historical accounts we see in the Fathers.
Yeah, and so that leads us into, and again, there were other illustrations for time. These are indicators of a tax collector. Then we hit Luke, looking at him as what Jerome said was a physician of Antioch, and his writings indicated that he was a physician. And I took a lot of time, an entire episode, just trying to see, all right, Jerome makes a claim, can it be substantiated? And we started with the beginning of Luke's gospel, how he said that he compiled a narrative, and he used phrases that were consistent with Hippocrates in the time going back, Jonathan, to the late Greek times of physician work. And he used an entire phrase, as many as undertaken. Epikureson was the word, which is only used by Luke here in a form of it in Acts. It's the same phrase, same exact usage in the phraseology that Hippocrates has when it says, as many as undertaken epikureson to speak or write concerning the healing art, which is the same phrase except for the part about healing art that he used in his intro, saying many have taken into hand to compile a narrative of the events that happened. Same opening line though. And again, that doesn't mean, oh, well, that just proves everything. That's it. He's a physician. But you have to ask yourself, why is he using old physician terminology that's not used in any other of the gospel accounts? And Luke only uses it here and in Acts. Matthew does not use it. Mark does not use it. John does not use it. It is a term that was used around 400 BC. And then he's using it in his writing in comparison to the other gospels.
Yeah, as not only a historian, but also a doctor, he would have been well acquainted with those writings. So naturally, you'll see that influence in his writings as well as having to study those records. So it's call it Freudian slip, or it's just the manner in where he's been accustomed as part of his education and studying to take that kind of vernacular into his writings. And that's once again another great illustration that you've done with the synoptics, and really tying the historical account or the allegation that's being made that by the fathers, that we're just not standing on the external evidence, which is really good, but it's consistent with what we find internally as well. Even coming down to the characteristics of what we would expect to see from a tax collector, a physician, a scribe or interpreter like Mark. So I think those, for me, those have been some of the biggest takeaways, really amplifying the internal evidence to show how consistent it is with the external, and showing that the common history is consistent on both ends.
Well, and with that being said, he comes at it from a different perspective because he's not an eyewitness. And that's what all the fathers said. Luke was not an eyewitness. He was a follower of Paul. So he had to do this under apostolic authority. And if we remember what he says there, he went and did this account just as the eyewitnesses did. And then he got his information from them. He studied them. He took note of them.
Mm-hmm.
So with that being said, Jerome also included, Jonathan, that he would have received this information from Paul and from the others that were with Jesus in Antioch and Jerusalem. But he went so far as to say that Luke actually put his name, like the gospel, the original, almost indicating the gospel of Luke would have originally had his name in it. He was addressing Theophilus, which let's not get into that, whether that's a person, a church, whatever, but that he was addressing somebody. And it's hard to address somebody and say, hey, I'm writing to you. And you're like, well, who is this? Well, I don't know where this is coming from. In fact, John Wenham in his book said it this way: Luke's preface would have been meaningless to the original readers unless the author's name had been known. Speak to Wenham's comments.
Yeah, and once again, we go to audience. Who is he writing to? Luke is accompanying Paul during his ministry, so they would have known who Luke was from the times that he had accompanied Paul, especially to those churches. And I think another important thing is, he had access to Mary, he had access to Peter, and so when Jerome talks about these other eyewitnesses, just as Eusebius does, that Luke is getting his information not only from Paul but from the other apostles as well. And we know from Paul's journeys, he obviously spent some time with Peter. He had access to Mary, and we see a common thing with all the synoptics. They all had access to Peter, and you see that natural connection kind of brewing between all three of them. But and that's what Wenham is making the point, that obviously they would have been very familiar, whether Theophilus was a code word. This is me, I'm writing to the churches. Obviously the churches were under guard. They just didn't want to just expose themselves. So obviously they would have known, because they got into all Paul's churches. So they would have had to been identified with someone that knew Paul, who was very close, to get access. So I think in the very beginning, it's sort of that code word for Luke coming in, but Luke would have accompanied in the circulation of that work.
Yeah, and with that, Leon Morris takes it a step further beyond not just the addressing and who and the name and the attachment, but he's going back to the fact that the name consistently shows up in history. And he says this: Luke was not, as far as we know, a person of such prominence in the early church as to have two such considerable volumes of these fathered onto him without reason. If people were guessing, would they not be much more likely to come up with an apostle? And what Moore is saying, another Wenham and him are both Anglicans, credit to your corner again. But what Morris is saying, I think, is a great question. why in the world would all of these people be trying to credit a gospel account to a guy in the beginning of his preface who says, I'm not an eyewitness? I mean, literally coming out saying, I'm not an eyewitness. I'm an interviewer of the eyewitnesses. If you're trying to sell an account as being apostolic, that's not how you start it. So why Luke? Luke, read the New Testament. He's minor. As minor as Demas or Philemon or any of Epaphras. He's minor in character. Tertius, who wrote the book of Romans for Paul, became the scribe for him, the amanuensis, as mentioned in the end of Romans. Okay, he's prominent because he wrote an entire letter like Romans for Paul. But Luke, why would everybody in history consider? And by the way, there is no other option. The closest one is Marcion, who butchered the book of Luke and gave it Paul's name. And why not? If you're going to give a gospel forgery and try to sell it, you don't use Luke. You do what the Gnostics did. You pick eyewitnesses. You pick Matthew. You pick Peter, guys like Peter and John. Thomas and John and James and Paul. You're not going to pick Luke. Why would you pick Luke? So what do you say about Leon Morris?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great example. I think it does go back to the fact that, and we see with the Gnostic groups, they're trying to identify obviously those at the Transfiguration, the three top, and those who you want to identify as authoritative. Obviously, if you're trying to sell a fabricated account, the last thing you want to do is separate yourself from the eyewitnesses in your kind of prologue and opening it up, just letting them know, hey, I'm not an eyewitness. This is what I gathered from others. I did use eyewitness testimony. So if you're trying to champion your case for an apostolic work, and you're trying to do it under false pretenses, this is not the way to do it. This is not what we see in history from the other sects that were trying to perpetrate accounts. They were trying to come off, and you know this better than anyone studying that literature, they're using their names and everything else to associate them with authoritative addition. And Luke did not. He pursued it from a standpoint of, I'm not an eyewitness, I'm stepping back, but I'm gathering this from the eyewitnesses themselves. And obviously, the churches that version was distributed to would have known that he was a follower of Paul and of the other apostles that he had information to. So, no, but that is an excellent point.
And kind of going into Luke again, these are indicators. Again, they don't finalize anything, but they're indicators. He has verses about physicians that the other gospels don't, like Luke 4:23, physician, heal yourself. He states this proverb that Jesus taught, focusing on the physician idea that the others do not. He also demonstrated grace towards the physicians when recollecting the story of Jesus healing the woman with the issue of the blood. Mark says suffered many things from the physicians, whereas Luke says spent all of her livelihood on physicians and they just couldn't help her. He's a little bit more graceful looking at it from the doctor's perspective, whereas Peter's looking at it from the woman's perspective, naturally. So you can see those nuances there. And even little small things like Mark's and Matthew are saying that, Peter's mother-in-law had a fever, and Luke went further, going, no, she had a high fever. So when investigating it, he would have taken it to this was a serious, it wasn't just any fever. It was a dangerous fever. Or leprosy. Well, how much leprosy? Luke would have been a detailed guy. He's going to ask questions like a doctor would. Peter and Matthew, who were there, are going to go, the dude was a leper. He's unclean. They didn't care about how much. He had leprosy. You get away from him. I mean, he was unclean. Luke's a doctor, and he wants to know, was it just a little bit on the face and a few spots on the arm, or was he just covered in leprosy? So Luke would have taken great interest in the detail of the leprosy and went as far as to say full of leprosy, where they just said leprosy. And he's the only one, Jonathan, who mentions the circumcision of Jesus. The only guy that is not a Jew that's writing the gospel accounts focuses on the most Jewish physical thing that you can think of, and that's circumcision. And Malchus, also another example, is Malchus's ear being cut off. He's the only one that mentions that Jesus picked it up and healed it. So again, more and more, there's others, the birth narratives that they don't mention that he does. Issues in there about the 18-year condition, which we'll get to in a second. But just on those alone, chime in on a few of those.
Yeah, it once again goes back to the characteristics and the vantage point, which shows the independency of those three accounts. They're looking at it from their vantage point. And this is what we see when you have 4 or 5 different witnesses at the scene of a crime. Their backgrounds and who they are really comes forth in their testimony as what they perceive from their vantage point. And here's another point where you do an excellent example highlighting where for Matthew, who is a tax collector, and you see his expertise speaking on matters relating to bookkeepers. Now you see with Luke. Luke is really emphasizing his technical skill and what he sees from the vantage point. I think the leprosy was really good because obviously to a common person, okay, well, this person is just sick. They have leprosy. Now, as far as the varying degrees of it, this is where the characteristics of who Luke is as a physician really comes through in the internal evidence, because then what we see is, okay, well, he has an extreme case of leprosy, so the severity was higher. Same thing with the fever. We see, this was a high fever. So he was able to tell the degrees of difference. Only someone within that profession would know. Obviously, in Matthew, he doesn't say it's a severe case. All he knows is this person has leprosy. So not speaking from that position of that job or that vantage, you wouldn't know that. And these are the small little subtle things that we pick up in the internal evidence that identifies with the Luke that we all know.
Yeah, and another example we talked about in addition to those was the woman with the 18-year back condition. He's the only one that even tells the story and records Jesus as using medical terminology. He says, but in the telling of the story, he tells the narrative from a condition, like he was diagnosing her with phrases, again, back to Hippocrates, using lingo back then. For example, it says, in a woman there had been disabled. Astheneos is the word he uses in Greek, by a spirit for over 18 years. She was bent over, could not straighten up at all. But when Jesus saw her, he called out to her and said, "Woman, you are free of your disability." And he uses a term that is directly in a diagnosis sense. And it's the word bent over. And he made sure to document that this was an 18-year condition. Like he wanted to give the diagnosis, but the documentation at the same time. And the word apoleluse that Jesus used, "you are free," is an ancient Greek medical term for relaxing tendons and membranes and taking off bandages. So when he said you're free, it's like her back was bent over for all this time, and those tendons had her back bent that way, but those tendons released. They were free from what she was dealing with. But Jesus used a word with Luke's diagnosis using a medical term, and Jesus is freeing her medically was a term he took interest in and noted that the others did not, again, indicating physician-like terms. Same thing with the Good Samaritan. In the parable, Jesus was clearly understanding and using stories that were made up and imaginary to illustrate that Jesus was in tune with first century usage of terminology that would have been prescribed by people like Galen and Hippocrates, talking about how to treat a wound using what we would call antiseptics by qualities of the alcohol, by using the same amount of oils that would bathe a wound to keep it a good protective coating from infection. These are things that he wrote that the others did not. Again, more and more indicators of what's taking place. Let's get to a couple more of these, and we've got to finalize here. Tyler, Simon says, sure. And in Matthew 7:31, I think he had asked a question before that. An objection I can see that Mark or some geographical issues concerning the routes Jesus traveled in Mark 7. Can you touch on these? Because that's apparently an objection that is raised. And he's saying, like in Mark 7:31, it's argued the route Jesus took is strange and is used as an argument that he was ignorant of the geography. He said, I also believe there are other geographical questions in Mark that are odd. Mark 7:31 is one. I have one at the top of my head. Yeah, actually, that one's actually not as highlighted as much as I think it's Mark 5. When you have the story of the maniacs of Gadara, which he records one, but Matthew records two of them being there. And you get into the regions of what's discussed there. Jonathan, I don't know if you've done much study on this, where it says he came to the country of the Gadarenes, and then you have the Gergensians, which is mentioned by Matthew. And then Luke follows Mark's protocol there as well. And so they're basically saying, well, that's a problem because these regions are different in the sense of you're talking about miles separated between them. I think the difference is like a 6 mile to a 30 mile different in the two terminologies. And so I guess one of the answers is that we have to remember, again, why is it that the two writers who are giving Greek audiences say Mark and Luke are consistent? Matthew is actually the one that's independent. Matthew's focusing on two guys. Luke and Mark are focusing on one guy. Why is it that the two guys writing to Greek audiences have a different term or place or location than the place that the guy writing to Jews is? So just to immediately go, boom, it's an error. These two are contradicting each other. Keep in mind, if people are saying that the order is Mark's first, Matthew's second, Luke's third, and some would put Luke into the 2nd century, saying that, well, Matthew corrected Mark because Matthew said Gergensenes and the Gadarenes is Mark, and Matthew used the other one, correcting Mark. So then what do you got to ask yourself is, so did Luke go back and correct Matthew and actually say, no, Mark had it right and Matthew had it wrong, and I'm going to correct Matthew? So what are you doing here? Or is there a common interest with the audiences of Luke and Mark that does not have common interest with Matthew? So just to throw these things out, by the way, there are manuscripts that harmonize them, and I don't think harmonizing them is necessary to do this. For example, these areas are pagan regions. So there's no doubt that there's going to be a different viewpoint and explanation from a Greek name versus a Hebrew name. So there could be differences in terminology and spellings on the basis of, once more, Matthew is written according to the testimony of the fathers. And as we've discussed already, that Matthew would have been written in Hebrew. So this could have been translated over into Greek from Hebrew spellings, and he's transliterating a location looking at a smaller region. Whereas, for example, how do I put this in modern terms? Okay, I live in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Spartanburg is the main county, but within that, there's different towns. I have an Inman zip code in Spartanburg County. So when I tell somebody I live in Inman, but I'm actually living in Spartanburg County. There's also other places. I grew up in Roebuck, but Roebuck is a part of Spartanburg County. So it's easy to go in there and say, if you're a writer, are you going to focus on, if you're writing to a bunch of Greeks, which one are they likely to know? So if I talk to somebody, say I'm talking to Jonathan who lives in Texas. If he says, where are you from? And I say, I'm from the Spartanburg, Greenville, upstate of South Carolina. That's a major area that is known on the graph. Greenville is one of the most, and oftentimes I tell people I'm in the Greenville area. I don't even say Spartanburg, even though Spartanburg's huge. Greenville's more renowned. Greenville is one of the top places to go visit. That's where it's one of the top places to go visit nationally. But we also have our airport is the Greenville-Spartanburg Airport. The airport is right between Greenville and Spartanburg. So I tell people I'm from Greenville and Spartanburg, and that took place in Spartanburg County. But if I'm talking to somebody from Spartanburg and they say, where do you live? I tell them I live in Inman. because they know the area. Then, oh, so you're right off of Lake Cooley, or you're on the other side of Lake Bowen. And we can have a discussion about the local area because they know the area. And somebody like Jonathan in Texas has no idea what I'm talking about. So think about that. And I'm not saying I'm right. I'm saying consider the other possibilities. If Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience, they would have been more familiar with specifics, just like I'm familiar with Spartanburg. And if I'm talking to other people from Spartanburg, they know where Inman is. They know where Campobello and Landrum are. They know these are locations within Spartanburg. So for me to be specific, they're going to know what I'm talking about. If I'm writing to people, and if I'm talking to guys in Texas and Seattle, they have no clue what I'm talking about when I say Inman. But if I say I'm in the upstate of South Carolina, Greenville, Spartanburg area that has a known airport, it's got one of the most traveled places to go see in Greenville, they're going to be a lot more clear on what I'm talking about. So if I'm writing to them, I'm not going to mention Inman. It has no relevance to them. So consider this. There's a region and a specific location. And if you're writing to people that don't know the specifics of the landmarks of Israel, you're not going to give them specifics they don't understand as much as regional sides. So I think that's one possibility there as well. And also you have the language barrier of where Luke and Mark are following Greek spellings and terminology, where Matthew may have been transliterating the spelling out of the Hebrew. Or again, it could be locational differences. And again, that could be based on the fact that Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience once again. What do you think, Jonathan?
Yeah, no, I would just concur with what you said. I think you said it probably more eloquently than I could. But it establishes a couple of things. First, Matthew wasn't copying from him. So the difference is right there showing that Matthew was not doing an amplified copy of Mark. He wasn't following him. This is one of the difference. But I think, as you said, it goes back down to audience, regional differences, names that would be familiar to, obviously, Hellenized Greeks, and those that the Jews of the area that would better identify with. So, yeah, I think what you said hit it right on. I think
and there's another possibility as well. And actually, I was going to mention this one, and that's some do believe they're two separate instances. Maybe, and I think I saw that in the comments. Let's see. Yeah, it was Nick. The demoniac instance happened 2 times. And the reason that some would say that is because there are 2 maniacs of Gadara that are mentioned in Matthew's gospel. So it could be an event and a returned event in a similar location. That is possible too. Again, there is more than one explanation. I don't know if I would follow that train of thought, Nick, although I'm not saying you're wrong. It is possible there's more instances because scenery differences, but if you follow the parallel of ministry, like if you follow the ministry experience there with Mark, what happened after this event, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are consistent on the timeline there, whereas Mark sometimes is not. But again, if we're talking about how do we answer this, we say there are multiple explanations outside of it's wrong. The ones that Jonathan and I were just talking about, or the one that Nick just posed, I wouldn't lean where Nick leans, but I would say it's probable and it's possible. So we don't have to just say it's wrong, it's an error. There are explanations as to why that may be the case that it is, just as it was demonstrated. And I think there's some others here. North and south, I think, is maybe some of the discussion going on there. And again, that's always funny. When you look at the New Testament, it'll say they went north or they went south, but when you look on a map, it's actually the other way around. But again, it's perspective. You're writing from your perspective. I cannot tell you, I've grown up in South Carolina my whole entire life. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard the phrase, I'm going up to Florida. It's like, no, you're going down to Florida. you're going down. But in their mind, when you're thinking about where you're sitting in your location and where you're attempting, we do the same thing. It's like we give the writers of scripture no latitude to be humans who talk with human terminology in their timelines and distances. It's like, well, that's just wrong. They don't even know north and south anymore. Good grief. Like, these people are just so stupid. They live there. If you were to dwell in the areas of my wonderful town of Spartanburg, these poor people think that Florida is going up. And they're not. But it's not because they're dumb and they don't know the geographical map. That's just how we speak of going to certain locations. And again, we have to remember the Bible is a divine and a human book. God didn't drain all the human elements in human conversations. And you could easily say these people are dumb in the South. They don't know where Florida is. They do know where Florida is. It's just not how we refer to it. Again, we have to give latitude of human experiences. And Tyler says, God bless Florida because he's in Florida. Well, we believe you're up. So, we don't think you're down, but here in South Carolina. But yeah, again, these are human experiences under divine helps of the Holy Spirit. I believe the Bible is inspired, but I don't believe inspiration drains human identity out of it. And yes, you're right. South Carolinians do speak differently. We apologize in advance. We're trying to get better. We're working on this. I can't speak for everybody. Your dad chimed in here and says, in Italy, you have the city of Lucca, and the province of Lucca is more than just the city of Lucca. And again, these are examples in Europe that are consistent as well. And that's a good point, which goes back to what I was saying about regions there. We're thinking 21st century. One of the greatest things I remember Bauckham saying, Jonathan, in his book, is the biggest mistake we make is interpreting first century text through 21st century mindsets. Things change. People change. Ideas change. The way we speak would change. The way we look at geographics change. They're not sitting there with Google Maps in the first century. They're not sitting there looking at satellite images of Jericho and Judea and Samaria and looking at the different, they're not looking at it from the same perspective we would. We have to look at it from a first century perspective. So again, these are indicators that there are other explanations. It doesn't automatically mean, well, there you go. These people are dumb. They didn't even know where they were. They lived there. Of course they did, but maybe they knew their region better than we do in the 21st century. That could just be the possibility that we have to deal with. Sadly, our time is being wrapped up. We've got about 4 minutes. Or now 3 minutes. Jonathan, tell everybody a little bit about the debate coming up, and we'll close on that. If any more questions come in, we'll answer them later.
Okay, well, this Saturday at 1 o'clock on Myth Vision's channel with Derek Lambert, he'll be hosting my debate with Dr. Mark Goodacre. So we will be defending not only the chronology of the order of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but we're going to dive into a lot of the conversation that Dr. Boyce and I were having on the Synoptics, their relationships, their sources. So we're probably going to spend a greater part of the discussion on there than we are going to spend on order. We are going to talk about the order and the publication. And I think a lot of it really has to do with Dr. Mark Goodacre's views on how the gospel came to be. He's probably going to talk a little bit about the late dating that Dr. Boyce and I kind of talked about after 70 AD, who was writing them, what was their sources for building upon the Synoptics. So that's going to happen at 1 o'clock. It's going to be my first debate as part of Explain International. So I'm very excited about defending this topic and sitting down with Dr. Mark Goodacre to really understand his perspective on this subject as well. So that'll be happening this Saturday at 1 o'clock on Myth Vision. So.
Yeah, and Jonathan, if you want to put the link in the comments when this is over, that would be great. That way people have access to it. Also, Jonathan wrote a blog recently on Did the Early Church Accept the Apocrypha as Canonical? You can find that on Explain International's Facebook page or on explaininternational.com. You can find on our website the blogs. There's also other blogs being released. Eric Wendt just recently published one on Mormonism, on the baptism of the dead, and there's others coming out in the next week. So keep your eyes open. Follow us on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook. As far as facts goes, you can also find us on Spotify. Again, we apologize for the lateness of this program today. We typically stay under an hour when we're dealing with one program, but this is a special program that invited my friend Jonathan on, so it took a little bit longer. So we appreciate tuning into our show today and giving grace for it being as long as it was. We trust that you will have a good rest of the night. Please follow us, share our link, share our videos, and we'll take any questions you may have. Have a blessed night. Grace and peace to you.